Sci-Fi Fridays podcast. Here, you'll be listening to science fiction stories infused with powerful themes relevant to today's world. I'm your host, Allie Anderson, and I'll be reading original stories that I have written myself. Episodes will be released every Friday. Today's episode is called Smartphones. Patty Hart was excited to try out her new smartphone at school. When her friend Catherine Morris's uncle heard that Patty loved working with technology and programming, he asked her and Catherine to beta test his company's new phone, which he called Superior Mechanical Alternative Reality Technology Phones, or smartphones for short. As Patty opened the doors to her school, she grinned when she spotted Catherine standing off to the side in the middle school hall. Catherine was frowning down at her phone. When she saw Patty come over, her face lit up. "There you are! My smartphone has been acting up this morning, so I've had some trouble texting you. How's your smartphone doing?" Patty gave Catherine a quick hug. "It's doing amazing! I can't believe how easy it is to use and to program." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Wait a second. Program? You're already changing the phone?" Patty nodded. "Yeah, just a little. I programmed it so it can do whatever I need or want it to do." The first bell announcing class rang, and in her pocket Patty's phone vibrated. "Let's start walking to class. We can talk on the way." "Okay." Catherine walked alongside Patty. She pulled out her smartphone. "How did you program it? My uncle says it's already programmed to do a lot of things for the average person." "Aha! There's the wormhole. It can do a lot of things for the average person. I'm not the average person, as you may recall." Patty slid the phone out of her pocket and typed in the passcode to turn it on. "Okay, so you reprogrammed it. What can it do now?" "Everything." Patty pressed a few buttons on her phone and spoke into it. "Step 1. Reboot Rosie the Robot's program. Step 2. Text Catherine a note." A soothing voice from the phone responded, "What note would you like to send Catherine?" This is how it can do everything. Patty moved the phone away from her face and smiled triumphantly at Catherine. Catherine frowned. "But I didn't receive a text." Patty shoved her phone back in the side pocket in her backpack. "Check now." Catherine pulled out her phone and then gave Patty an impressed look. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised by now, but I am. So is it only voice-activated?" Patty shook her head. "No, I have to type my voice command in if I don't want to use the voice command." Catherine opened the door to their first class of the day, letting Patty go first. "You'll have to tell my uncle about those changes. He'll want to figure out how they can manufacture something like that." Patty smiled, raising an eyebrow. "Ah, but you can't manufacture talent, can you?" She walked over to the seat where she sat next to Catherine every day. Catherine shrugged. "He'll want to try." Just as Patty sat down, the teacher, Mrs. Lawson, closed the classroom door and faced the class. Patty glanced around the room and noticed that there was a new student sitting off to the side of the room. She seemed upset by something, but Patty couldn't tell what. "Before we start our fascinating studies in science today, class, I would like to announce and welcome a new student. Dear, could you please stand up and tell us your name and something about yourself?" The new girl shrugged. Reluctantly, she stood up. "I'm Sage Waters, and I like to play soccer." As soon as she finished, she plopped herself back down in her chair. Mrs. Lawson nodded in approval. "Thank you, Sage. Now to begin our lesson, let me draw your attention to the whiteboard." The rest of the day, Patty used her smartphone to record any lessons that she might need to listen to later when completing homework and to log any assignments that were due at a certain time. At lunch, the sound of students eating and talking and laughing rang out throughout the cafeteria. It smelled like cooked spinach, which is what the cafeteria's lunch boss must appear to be serving for part of lunch today. Patty and Catherine always brought their lunch to school instead of buying it at the cafeteria, so they skipped the long line of students. Together they weaved through the throng of students and sat in their favorite spot in the corner of the school cafeteria. Once they sat down, Patty began scrolling through all the things she had added to her phone from school. Smartphones sure come in handy, don't they? Patty showed her progress to Catherine as she sat down in her next to her in the cafeteria. Catherine shrugged. "Yours does. Mine just keeps kind of malfunctioning." Patty set her phone down. "Really? Do you want me to take a look at it?" Catherine shook her head. "No, it's fine. My uncle's coming over to my house this afternoon, and I'll talk to him about it then." One-handedly, Patty pulled out her lunch bag. "Okay, but if you can't figure it out, let me know. I'd love to see if there's anything wrong with it." She grabbed out the sandwich she'd made the night before using a recipe she'd found on her smartphone. Catherine nodded. I will. She pulled out her own lunch and began eating it. Do you think our school will have a chance in the robotics state competition this year? Patty shrugged. Maybe. For most of lunchtime, Patty and Catherine didn't have much to say to each other. Catherine was awfully quiet as Patty scrolled through her phone's apps while she ate her sandwich. Patty guessed that maybe she was thinking about something and didn't want to be interrupted. The cafeteria was loud with the sound of voices around them, but neither Patty nor Catherine joined in. Finally, Catherine broke the silence bubble between them. Hey, look, there's the new girl from science class. Sage was her name, wasn't it? Patty looked up from her phone. Sage had just come out of the lunch line and seemed to be looking for a spot to sit. The cafeteria was pretty full. Maybe we should have her sit with us. Patty shrugged. Maybe. Her phone pinged and she typed the passcode in to check her messages. It was a text from her mom. I'm going to go talk to Sage. Catherine stood up and grabbed the plastic bag that had held her sandwich. Aren't you coming? Patty nodded, not looking up from her phone. Yeah, just give me a minute. She heard Catherine sigh, then walk over to the garbage can. By the time Patty had finished replying to her mom, she gathered what was left of her sandwich and stuffed it in her bag. She scanned the room for Catherine. Where had she gone again? That was right. She was talking to the new girl. Finally, Patty spotted Catherine across the room. She was smiling and seemed to be having a good time with Sage. Patty decided not to take it personally and plopped back down in her seat. She pulled out her phone again and opened a reading app to pass the time. That afternoon, after the final bell for class to end sounded, Patty followed Catherine as she headed for the curb where they always stood while they waited for their moms to pick them up. Catherine was still quiet, and she hadn't said much ever since lunch. After a while of agonizing silence, Patty's mom's car pulled up to the curb. Patty smiled at Catherine. I'll see you tomorrow. Catherine nodded. Yep, I'll tell my uncle about the changes you made to your smartphone. He'll probably want to take a look at it. Okay. Patty opened the door to the back seat of her mom's car. Seated up front in the driver's seat beside Patty's mom was the driver bot. Driver bots were human-sized and human-looking robots who drove their humans' cars. Some time ago, when the technology had just been introduced, the government had decided it was best to make a law that said only driver bots could drive vehicles. After all, humans were unpredictable, while technology can be programmed and therefore dictated on what things to do and how to do them. Patty smiled at Catherine, who didn't smile back but simply nodded. Bye! Patty waved to Catherine as the driver bot pulled away from the curb. The next day at school, Patty was running behind. Her alarm on her smartphone had woken her up an hour later than she was supposed to get up, making her late for school. When she arrived at school, her hair was still half wet from a rushed shower and her appearance in disarray. She saw the new girl, Sage, sitting in Patty's usual spot beside Catherine. Trying not to gawk like a deranged chicken, Patty found a seat at the back of the room while Mrs. Lawson lectured her on the importance of punctuality. As Mrs. Lawson turned to the rest of the class and continued the lesson for the rest of the day, Patty felt distracted. Why on earth had her smartphone not done its job? Why was Catherine betraying her? She opened the cover of her school tablet and tapped on the article she was supposed to be reading as it was read aloud by her classmates. Much to her dismay, a loud ringing sounded in her back pocket. Patty jumped up and pulled her phone out. Fumbling to quiet the ringtone, Patty tried not to cry. Mrs. Lawson raised her eyebrows at Patty but nodded for the student reading, who just happened to be Catherine, to continue. Catherine shot a glare at Patty before she turned back to her tablet. The rest of the class time went by slowly. Patty had always enjoyed Mrs. Lawson's science and technology class, but today it was torture reading about the history of artificial intelligence. As soon as the bell rang, she shot out of her chair and yanked her backpack on her back. Patty sighed as she left the classroom. It was rare for her to have off days. Today felt like an awful off day, with problems she wasn't sure how to fix. Had she done something to hurt Catherine's feelings? What was going on with her phone? As Patty walked to her next class, she pulled her phone out of her back pocket and made sure that it wouldn't make any noises in class again. Then she looked at all her programming to see if it had somehow accidentally been programmed wrong. It looked fine to her. Patty! Patty turned on her heels to the voice who called for her. It was Catherine. Patty frowned. Catherine grinned at her like nothing had ever happened. There you are. I've been looking for you all day, and then you were late to class, and where's Sage? Patty peered over Catherine's shoulder, then looked around her. She folded her arms and frowned. Catherine seemed at a loss for words. What? I saw that new girl, Sage, sitting next to you in science class today. Why didn't you save a seat for me? Catherine opened her mouth, then closed it again. I thought you were out sick today. I couldn't reach you on your smartphone, and you were running behind. And besides, Sage is lonely. It's not easy being the new girl, you know. Yes, I do. All too well. But it feels like you're trying to replace me. Patty whipped around and stormed away. That would give Catherine something to think about. It gave Patty something to think about on her way to class as well. Why had Catherine let Sage, a girl she'd met just the other day, sit in the seat Patty always sat in? She didn't even know Sage. Patty had known Catherine ever since she'd begun going to school here. Sure, Patty was new at the time, too, but they were good friends now. Why did Sage have to come in and ruin a good friendship? Patty realized she wasn't looking where she was going as she stomped through the halls. She looked around to see where she was. Most of the students had made it to their classes already and were out of the hallways. The nearest classroom was room 135, not too past her next class. Quickly, Patty turned around and headed the other direction, this time looking where she was going. Her smartphone buzzed in the back of her pocket, but she ignored it. It had caused her enough trouble already. Finally, she made it to her class. The teacher, Mr. Marshall, smiled at Patty as she walked in. Quickly, she found a seat somewhere in the middle of the room and sat down. She had just set her backpack on the floor when the student walking past tripped over it. Sorry. The girl turned around and set Patty's backpack upright again. Patty looked up at the girl's face and was surprised to see that it was Sage. She sighed. It's fine. Patty knew she shouldn't hold a grudge against someone she hardly knew for something she didn't do, but for some reason that felt like the only thing she could do right now to get through the day. Before long, it was lunchtime. Patty piled in the cafeteria just like all the other students in the middle school. She began walking over to the spot she always sat in with Catherine, but stopped. Catherine was sitting there, but so was Sage. With a frustrated sigh, Patty found an empty spot at a table where a couple students had their faces buried in their phones. She pulled out her lunch and began eating her salad she'd grabbed from last night's dinner's leftovers. Looking at the kids sitting at her table, she recognized the girl. Patty had seen her in a few of her classes before. She'd never noticed her or tried to make friends with anyone else because she'd always had Catherine. But now Catherine had Sage. Or maybe Patty should try talking to this girl here. What was her name again? Chelsea? Or was it Charlotte? Patty set her salad fork down and smiled at the girl. Hi, I'm Patty. I've seen you in class before, but I don't think we've ever met. The girl didn't even look up from her phone. She just kept scrolling on what looked like some sort of social media. How rude. Patty decided to pretend she'd never said anything and kept eating. As she picked up her fork again and stabbed some lettuce, a thought occurred to her. Was this how she'd been treating Catherine all this time? While Catherine was trying to have a conversation with Patty, all Patty wanted to do was think about her new phone and how great a job she'd done with programming it. So much for the phone now. It was no use to her now that it decided to act up on her today. No wonder Catherine wanted to find a new friend to replace Patty. That's what Patty might have wanted to do. A sick feeling churned around the bottom of Patty's stomach. It was time to make this right. Before the bell sounded for lunch to end, Patty quickly gathered her lunch items and shoved them in her backpack. She slung her backpack on her back and sprinted over to where Catherine was laughing and talking with Sage. Catherine spotted Patty approaching and grinned. Hi, Patty. Come sit down. She patted the seat next to her. Patty sat down. Listen, Catherine, I've been thinking. Today has been a pretty awful day, but it's shown me something that I wasn't seeing before. Catherine gave Patty a puzzled look but stayed silent. I'm sorry I've been such a bad friend to you. I should have listened to you when you wanted to talk to me yesterday. Patty fidgeted with the edge of her shirt sleeve. Will you forgive me? Catherine smiled, her face lighting up. Of course I forgive you, Patty. You are my closest friend, and I never want to replace you. She turned to Sage, who'd been quiet since Patty had come over. I'd never replace you either, Sage. Have you met Patty yet? Sage looked over at Patty shyly. She smiled. I think we've bumped into each other before. Or I've bumped into her backpack before. Patty laughed. It's nice to meet you too, Sage. She leaned on the table. So where are you from? Thank you so much for listening to my very first Sci-Fi Fridays podcast episode. It is obviously far from perfect, but I am excited to take you all along on my journey on this new learning experience. After each podcast episode, I'm going to be posing a question for my listeners to answer. You can head on over to the link in the description or type the link allieanderson.com/sci-fi-fridays-smartphones in your browser to comment and answer the question. These questions are called questions of the day. Today's question of the day is, if you could own a smartphone and make it do one thing for you, what would that be? I can't wait to hear from you. Until next Friday, this is Allie Anderson, signing off.